If there was a man who controlled the narcotics drug trade with a vice grip, then that man was Ibrahim Akasha. Akasha was the region's mafioso extraordinaire, and he controlled the drugs trade in Kenya and Europe at large like a game of chess. To enable him conduct business, he had all the government agencies, politicians, the police, and the judiciary in his pocket. He was a gang leader. He lived like a gang, and he died in the same bloody way that he led his life. Some members of his family would die in the same manner, driven by the feuds to control the narcotics drug trade, and it would take the intervention of the US Drug Enforcement Agency to tame their influence. This is the story of Ibrahim Akasha, a multi-million narcotics drug dealer whose influence spread from Kenya, Pakistan, and Europe. Little is known about Ibrahim Akasha Abdallah's beginning, that it's hard to map out his childhood and early years. He was a Kenyan of Palestinian origin. His father, Abdallah Ibrahim, came to colonial Kenya from Sudan. Abdallah had spent most of his adulthood in Iraq, but he settled his family in Kenya. One of his sons, Ibrahim Akasha, settled and built a legitimate transport business based in Mombasa. According to some reports citing family insiders, Akasha also built Kenya National Taxi Corporation before selling it to the government. While not independent verifiable, it is likely because Akasha built his foothold in the transportation business. His main business, Akasha Transport, would become the main front of his massive smuggling empire. From licensing records, Akasha Transport didn't seem to have grown outwardly, with registered vehicles reducing from 12 to 5 in a mere 5 years later. In 1988, the company was mentioned on the floor of Parliament for not paying a driver's full wages for 6 months of work. Other than that, it stayed off the limelight, a small business on the outside with one of the most important undercurrents in the region. The transport business was a perfect cover for Akasha, as it allowed him to find and repackage drugs and gave him insights into shipping, the port business, and terrestrial transport. It became a blueprint for Kenyan smugglers. Initially, Akasha was involved in gang running, supplying small arms across the region. When arms trafficking became more lucrative as conflicts escalated across the region, arms traders such as Akasha found themselves fighting even more powerful cartels within the Kenyan government. So he turned into something that seemed less attractive to meddling, the drug trade. To thrive here, he perfected the model that had worked with gangs, using the Akasha Transport Company as the main cover. He also expanded the business, including several speedboats and a few warehouses for repackaging. Even with his iron hand control of the port, he still needed to be careful. As the drug shipment grew, the shipboats would meet the drug ships in the high seas and unload the cargo. Then they would dock in nondescript fishing villages where the drugs would be unloaded onto cars and taken to warehouses and sometimes Akasha's Nyali house. Akasha became the main conduit for the flow of hashish, opium, heroin, and cannabis from East Africa to Europe. He was relevant not only to South Asian and South American drug routes, but also the Italian mob that had been settling in Malindi from the 1960s. No drugs entered or left Kenya or the Horn of Africa without Akasha's involvement from the mid-1980s to the new millennium. For this, he became immensely wealthy and powerful in a short time, almost always impeccably dressed in a dark-colored suit. This chain-smoking drug lord became one of the most important criminals of his time, combining a business acumen with a charming and dark personality. By the time he died, he was trying to control everything from wholesale to retail in the drug business across the entire region. He wasn't satisfied with being a mere middleman for far-off cartels. He wanted to grow it and to produce it too. Several vast marijuana estates in the Mount Kenya rainforest were linked back to the Akasha clan. Akasha invested his money in real estate, hospitality, petrol stations, and many other sectors. He also had investments in Basel, Dubai, Sudan, and Lebanon. One of the ways he laundered his money was, funny enough, by buying treasury bonds. In the first month of 1999 alone, the Kenyan government issued 3 billion shillings worth of bonds in the Kenyan market. The minimum purchase was Kenya shillings 50,000, and since the banking world still lived in a pre-August 1998 world, very few questions were asked about the source of money invested. Akasha bought several homes in his lifetime, including a villa in Nyali, a farm in Shanzu, and a house in Whispers Estate, a posh Nairobi suburb. The Nyali house was a favorite because it was close to the sea and it was in a prime, mostly private location. Ibrahim Akasha lived large and was a member of the Nyali Golf and Country Club. Former members of the drug lord would call gawking at the new shiny vehicles that would drive out of the compound at the height of the dawn's rain. Most of them didn't have license plates, and their owners were Rolex wearing big spenders. In Mombasa, the name Akasha came to be identified with fear, money, and immense power. He had political and economic connections and links with the banking industry that made it incredibly easy to put his millions into the financial system. From the 1980s, Asian bankers had begun a spree, opening up small banks that would eventually collapse with liquidity or corruption issues. With money flowing from all the directions, from drugs to arms and government kickbacks, the next decade was a busy year for Kenya's banking industry. It is said that men of Akasha's ilk funded the 1992 Kano's victory in the elections, using their extensive connections and deep pockets to get Moi the win he needed. The Moi campaign was marked by an unprecedented flow of cash, despite the economy grinding to a halt. One of his main campaigners became synonymous with the Kenya shillings 500 shillings note, which seemed to be the only denomination he gave away. The underworld stood to gain from a Moi victory and would spend the next decade expanding their businesses, keeping their hands low and safe by roping in key Kanu men. At least one other presidential candidate in the 1992 elections, John Haron Mwau, used helicopters in the campaigns for the first time in Kenyan history. In the decades later, the incredibly wealthy former police sharpshooter would be listed by the US government as a drug lord, triggering a series of suits to clear his name. The Akasha drug empire in Kenya was built on access and ruthlessness. He had access to almost all layers of Kenyan government and effectively controlled the port of Mombasa in the decade before he died. The Kroll report mentions the Akasha clan in page 59 as one of the most important business associates of Philip Moi, one of the sons of Kenya's second president. Another source of critical information on the Akasha business model is the judicial inquiry into the conduct of Justice Philip Waki, a Court of Appeal judge. In 2004, 3 witnesses openly confessed to having seen or heard of Akasha connection with Waki in Mombasa as early as 1994. 2 of them in the process confessed to being part of the Ibrahim Akasha drug empire. One, Festus Ngorwa Mwimburi, had climbed up the ranks from a houseboy to the transport manager in the main business, but was by 2004 a miraa farmer in Meru. Another witness, Kulshid Bhatt, was a contractor who had renovated the Akasha house in 1994, only to be abducted and beaten by the Akashas and his sons when he went to claim the balance owed. In 1995, the Akasha made their most brazen abduction, that of Assistant Commissioner of Police called Philip Kalume Chai. Kalume went to the Nyali house to question them about an abduction, only to be disarmed and held hostage for more than 3 hours. He didn't speak of it until 3 years later, after Ibrahim Akasha died. At the time, in 2003, Kalume said Akasha had seemed to know a lot about him in their 3 hours together. His silence, despite climbing the ranks of the police force, suggests that the fear of the Godfather was still present and now embodied by his erratic sons. Such access and power made Ibrahim Akasha many friends and enablers, but it also attracted some powerful enemies. In Bat Kibati's The Memoir of a Kenyan Spy Master, he speaks about leading a raid on Ibrahim Akasha. Kibati, the top spy in the coast at the time, was informed by his Nairobi counterpart Kashim Rashid that Akasha was a member of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and was planning a terrorist attack. One of the PLO's offshoot was the terror group behind the hijacking that triggered Operation Entebbe, and the terror groups had been blamed for at least one other known attack in Kenya. Kibati didn't find anything linking Akasha, a Kenyan of Palestinian origin, with the Palestinian terror group. Kibati says Akasha told him that Kasim was intimidating Arab businessmen across the country to show them how powerful he was. Although there aren't clear links between Akasha and the PLO terrorists, it's now common knowledge that terror is funded directly and indirectly by illegal trade such as the drug trade. Kibati's attitude to Akasha, visible in the singular paragraph about the drug road, intimate the Kenyan's attitude to the man at the time. He was a businessman being harassed by a top spy, but his criminal activities were well known to everyone at the time. Akasha survived by making friends more powerful than his enemies, ensuring he could have insider knowledge to intimidate anyone who came after him and to stay from trouble. During the February 2000 stint that netted tons of hashish, the food was still hot on the table when the officers stormed the house. The Akasha clan in the house had already clearly been warned. To stay away from the limelight, Akasha bribed and muscles his way from the headlines. Before he was arrested in 1996, at least one Mombasa-based journalist had been arrested and charged under the Penal Code for investigating him. Akasha would later be shot by a lone gunman in that street called Brad Street in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. That day was May 2000. Akasha was on his way to meet a coffee shop owner called Magdi Balsoom. Magdi was the elder brother to Munil Balsoom, a key cog in the European drug underworld. Munil was one of Akasha's contact and customers, and they had a common business problem for which Magdi had become mediator. But the Kenyan drug lord would never make it to the meeting. A few meters into the Brad Street, a lone gunman cycled up to Akasha and shot him 7 times. The first bullet ripped through Akasha's face, as did the next 3. The 5th and 6th tore through his heart, and the 7th cut his stomach. He died right there on the Brad Street in his wife's hand. Ibrahim Akasha's downfall culminated in that ruthless murder in the far-off European city. It had, however, begun with a series of mistakes he had made in the half a decade before. What had happened? In 1996, Akasha was arrested and charged with drug trafficking. A quiet, ruthless mafia don who preferred to work behind the shadows, the publicity unnerved the unusually calm Akasha. He and his sons had a tiff with journalists in the courtroom, which made his case even more prominent. Getting arrested was a mistake because Ibrahim Akasha didn't make mistakes. He lived by the rule book, which included making sure that everyone who could mess with his empire was rich, or scared, or both. Why he was arrested remains a mystery, but it's likely he fell out with some of his powerful friends. He still managed to avoid the custodial sentence though. A man like Akasha didn't go to jail because he knew enough to bring down entire governments. In 1997, one of his sons, Hassan, was arrested and jailed in Tanzania for smuggling mad drugs. Like his father the year before, Hassan didn't finish his sentence. The next year, Yusuf Abdallah, Ibrahim's younger brother, was arrested in Kenya with 2 Pakistanis who had sneaked in drugs hidden in a consignment of bath towels and drinking straws. All the 3 were jailed for a decade and fined 39 million, 3 times the value of the drugs. Yusuf would resurface much later in a bizarre car theft involving former President Moi and then legislator and assistant minister Fred Gumu. For a man used to unparalleled power, these arrests made Akasha change his transport model. The first aspect of this was to find new partners, new conduits, such as the Yugoslav Mafia, that were unrelated to him. Akasha's new business model made it harder for him and his family to be as exposed, but it also took power away from him. The new reality became evident with the first shipments, a consignment of heroin delivered through the Yugoslav conduits to Munil Balsoom, who forwarded it to the Dutch cartel led by a man called Sam Kreper. According to Dutch police, Kreper wasn't the original intended customer for the consignment. Still, he refused to pay, triggering a chain of events that left everyone involved in the deal dead. Akasha left Kenya in January 2000 under a fake passport to demand his money from the Dutchman. 2 weeks later, Akasha's Nyali house was raided and he became a wanted man again. But he still had business to finish in Europe. On the 3rd day of May 2000, a Wednesday, an aging man of medium height stepped onto the city red light, Blood Street in Amsterdam, Netherlands. In one hand, he grasped his Egyptian wife's hand, a plumpish Kenyan woman with a disarming smile and a receding hairline. Ibrahim Akasha could have passed for just another tourist, but he wasn't. In Kenya and the Horn of Africa, he was the most important drug lord, a man so powerful that his name was whispered. In Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Europe, he was spoken of in war, a drug dealer extraordinaire. If you needed any massive shipment of drugs sneaked into Europe, Akasha was the man you turned to. He had once successfully smuggled an entire container of drugs into the Mombasa port. One of the lesser discussed elements of this fatal deal was that when Crepa refused to pay Balsum the money that belonged to Akasha, the Kenyan drug lord kidnapped the Yugoslav conduit who connected them. He held them in Mombasa in January 2000 and demanded US dollars 2.5 million from the Dutch syndicate. It was never clear whether the unnamed Yugoslav was later released or was found during the Nyali raid or killed in revenge. As the underworld tiff escalated in the early months of 2000, Madi, Munir's brother, became the mediator. From his cave bar red light on a street in Amsterdam, Madi tried to end the war by bringing all sides to the table. Magdi was the reason Ibrahim Akasha flew to Amsterdam with Hayat, his wife, to seek out the Yugoslav drug mess. But it doesn't seem as if Madi's solution was to find an amicable solution. Dutch police suspected that at the time that he either pulled the trigger or hired the man who killed Akasha and cycled away. His solution was to end the Kenyan to solve that problem for both sides, but it only made things worse. The Yugoslavs suspected Madi has done so on Crepa's bidding, a seemingly simple business solution to a problem the Dutchman had. Unlike the Yugoslav, Crepa didn't have a man held hostage in a house in East Africa. He also hadn't lost the most important conduit for drugs on the East African coast. After Akasha died, Crepa still refused to pay, even after the Yugoslav gang killed his right-hand man John Fema, so they finished off Crepa too, 4 months after Akasha's death. At his funeral, one of the main theme songs was the score for the 1970 Mafia film, The Godfather. Madi would die on the same street Akasha died on in 2002, while Munir would be killed at a traffic light stop in 2004. Munir's daughter was injured in the attack, but she survived. Ibrahim Akasha's body landed in Mombasa on May 13, 2000, 10 days after he died, to the signs of acrimony in his large family. He was a billionaire with an estate estimated at US $100 million, traversing several continents and in most cases hidden to even his own family. In his lifetime, he had 3 wives, Karma, Hayat and Fatuma. Karima bore him 3 children, Habib, Kamaldeen and Hassan. In 1997, Habab was jailed in Tanzania for murder exposition, although he was released later. By the time Akasha died, he had divorced Karima. Ghazi Hayat bore Akasha Najma, Nurdin Tinta, Duzia, Faisal and Abdallah. Hayat was Egyptian, and it was she who would hold him as the Don as he died on a cold Amsterdam street in May 2000. It is unclear whether Hayat accompanied Akasha because the 2 middlemen he was dealing with in the Netherlands were also Egyptian. Fatuma bore him his favorite son Baktash and Walda and Ibrahim, named for his father. Baktash, a barefaced, baby-faced man, served as one of his father's closest men and his bodyguard. He was also the heir apparent, much to the chagrin of his brothers and stepmothers. Among the many things the Akashas became known for after the death of their godfather were public fights, accusations and counter-accusations, and mysterious death. The death of Akasha signaled the collapse of one of the most prominent narcotics drug traffickers, and so the death of his sons and the entry of the US Drug Enforcement Agency to rein on the influence of the Akasha family. For instance, as he sat in his Land Rover Discovery, Kamaldeen Akasha had little reason to worry. He was checking on one of his many businesses, the Zamzam petrol station in Makupa, Mombasa. The drug mafia Don and his brothers were in a tiff, but there wasn't much about it, at least nothing worth looking over his shoulder for. Behind him, a slender white gunman dressed in a black t-shirt and a woolen hoodie sneaked up. When he got close enough to Kamaldeen, he fired thrice in quick succession. Then he ran away to the getaway car and fled the scene. Kamaldeen died right then. Less than an hour later, two of Kamaldeen's brothers got to the scene where their brother had died. The brothers, Baktash and Hassan, blamed their other brother Tinta for Kamaldeen's murder. Although they first blamed Tinta, the Akashas soon found out two other suspects. One, Stojanovic Milan, a Serb, was a neighbor of the Akashas in Nyali at the time. The other was a Kenyan called Jackson Wawero. The Akasha sons will aid them in November 2004 as they made their way to Nairobi from the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. In a bizarre case of citizens' arrest involving a mafia family, they chased the car down, pulled them out, and drove them to the Grand Regency at gunpoint. Then they took them to the Central Police Station, where the two were charged with Kamaldeen's murder. Miran and Awero were acquitted in 2007, 5 years after Kamaldeen's death. They sued the Akasha family for Kenya shillings 1 billion in compensation. Kamaldeen's death, like his father's, remains unsolved. In a year after Kamaldeen's death, a witness, Gani Taib, told the Waki inquiry that it was Kamaldeen and not Tinta who had snitched on their father in late 1999. Since the death remains unresolved, it is unclear whether he was killed in revenge for betraying his estranged brother. The betrayal had made Ibrahim Akasha an international fugitive, hunted by Interpol, and Baktash had been arrested. Another 2 deaths followed in the Akasha clan in the decade after. In 2007, one of the Akasha grandchildren crawled to a pool and drowned during a police raid. 3 years later, Saud, Baktash's wife, was found hanging by a thin rope in their Nyali house. Baktash was also included in the inquest in the death of a British tycoon, Harry Vivas. Harry died on Valentine's Day 2013 in Nyali of suspected poisoning. His son Richard told the inquest that Baktash had threatened him with a gun, telling him to stop investigating his father's death. 3 years later, in 2005, Baktash told a court in Nairobi that Kamaldeen had been killed in a vicious family feud over a hashish payment he had cut everyone else from. Kamaldeen's death was the second in the prominent Akasha clan, the first being that of its founding godfather, Ibrahim Akasha, 2 years before. In 2015, Baktash and his young brother, Ibrahim, were indicted by a New York court. They had been caught planning a new drug route to the United States with two partners, an Indian and a Pakistani. Baktash later blamed the sting on his brother Tinta, following in what had become a clear cleavage in the Akasha clan. The US government stated its intentions to charge the new leaders of the Akasha clan with supplying and organizing the supply of massive quantities of heroin into the North American country. The would-be client, an undercover drug enforcement agency agent, had gotten into the circle by portraying himself as a wealthy player in the underworld, with words of cash and talk of a private jet. The Akashas were in the news again after that, this time because of an Indian partner in the case, Vicky Goswami. Vicky, a former pilot and drug kingpin from the 1990s, had perfected a smuggling system where he sent 5 cases of mad drugs per day from Mumbai to Cape Town on planes. He was later arrested and jailed in Dubai. After his release, he moved to Kenya and kept a relatively low profile until he was arrested during a DEA end-up sting in Nyali. In 2016, Indian police traced several massive holes of ephrine, the controlled substance that is the primary ingredient in an illegal recreational drug, to Goswami. The Indian, now wanted in 2 countries and facing charges in the third, disowned it. A large catch of drugs had been intended for Kenya, where Goswami and his partners were in an advanced stage of a plan to build a factory in Kenya to manufacture 93% of pure meth. Indian police suspected the Akasha brothers were primary partners here too, and were said to be considering adding them to the charge sheet. In 2014, Baktash Akasha and his brother Ibrahim Akasha were arrested with his 2 associates in Mombasa, Kenya, by Kenya Anti-Narcotics Unit officers after providing 99 kilograms of heroin and 2 kilograms of meth to U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency informants posing as drug traffickers of a South American drug cartel. The two were arraigned in a U.S. court where they were cited as leaders of a sophisticated international drug trafficking network based in Kenya, responsible for tons of narcotics shipment throughout the world. For over 20 years, they manufactured and distributed drugs, sometimes using violence against those who posed a threat to their enterprise. When the two brothers encountered legal interference, they tried to bribe officials, including judges, prosecutors, and police officers, to avoid extradition to the United States. Their bribery scheme ended in 2017 when the brothers were extradited to the US from Kenya, and the DEA agents brought them to the United States for prosecution. On 24 October 2018, Akasha and Ibrahim Akasha pleaded guilty in a United States federal court to conspiracy to import heroin and meth, conspiring to use and carry machine guns and destructive devices in connection with their drug trafficking activities and obstruction of justice. In August 2019, Akasha was convicted to 25 years in prison, and in January 2020, his brother Ibrahim received a sentence of 23 years. They are still serving in prison in the United States.